Hello everyone and welcome to Midnight Goth Radio. Our channel is mainly focused on music, but we're starting a new series of videos to help strengthen the Gothic subculture, featuring stories, band interviews, reviews and more. We'll be bringing you plenty of fresh and exciting content to keep the spirit of the Gothic scene alive. In this video, we're going to tell the story of how goth music began, back in the early days of post-punk. But before we start talking about the music itself, let's talk a little bit about what the goth subculture is. Perhaps the best place to start would be in the cathedrals of the Middle Ages and in poems. The very word Gothic was originally a slight used for medieval architecture. Much later, 18th to 19th century authors like Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker would write spooky classics like Frankenstein and Dracula, building the dark romantic vibe that we goths still love. The first Gothic architecture appeared in France in the 12th century, beginning with the Basilica of Saint-Denis near Paris. You may think that the Basilica of Saint-Denis is still far from being something that inspired the vampire castles of stories, but it was still where this style of architecture began. Crypts and cemeteries around churches also contributed to Gothic inspiration years later. Over the years, as Gothic architecture evolved, we've seen the rise of majestic cathedrals that look straight out of a vampire movie, such as Cologne Cathedral in Germany or Notre Dame in Paris. It's no wonder these monuments continue to inspire stories and song lyrics. But of course, the Gothic subculture has this name because it is not limited to architecture, clothing or music, but goes even further with literature, which also emerged long before the first Bauhaus songs. So let's talk about Gothic literature. Many people think that Gothic literature is based solely on vampire stories or anything related to horror, but we're going to give a brief history of how Gothic literature began, especially since the focus of our video is on music, with a brief introduction to what the Gothic subculture is. Who is considered the first Gothic writer? Although there are thousands of memes on the internet, no, Edgar Allan Poe was not the first. Horace Walpole is considered the father of Gothic literature. In 1764, he published The Castle of Otranto, the first officially Gothic work. He was an English writer, politician and lover of the arts. He is considered the father of the Gothic novel because he inaugurated the genre with The Castle of Otranto, 1764. He himself called his work a Gothic story, a term that would later name the entire genre. Before Walpole, English literature was marked by neoclassicism and sentimental romance. He broke with this by creating a narrative with medieval castle in ruins, supernatural dark atmosphere and cursed families. Walpole not only wrote the first Gothic novel, but also built England's first neo-Gothic house, Strawberry Hill in Twickenham, near London. The mansion featured towers, stained glass windows and shadowy rooms, foreshadowing the Gothic revival style of the 19th century. Many scholars believe that the atmosphere of the Castle of Otranto was born there. After reflecting on the importance of Horace Walpole, I cannot ignore the other great voices who gave shape and depth to Gothic literature. Each of them carried the torch of darkness further, leaving behind works that still haunt our imagination. Anne Radcliffe, with the Mysteries of Udolpho, perfected the art of atmosphere. Her ruined castles, wild landscapes and unseen terrors shaped the very essence of the Gothic mood. Then came Matthew Gregory Lewis, whose infamous The Monk shocked readers with its violence, forbidden desires, and unflinching descent into corruption. Mary Shelley, in Frankenstein, married Gothic horror with the dawn of science fiction, creating not just a monster but a timeless meditation on human ambition and despair. John Polidori's The Vampire gave us the aristocratic vampire, a figure that would inspire Bram Stoker decades later. Edgar Allan Poe deepened the Gothic spirit in America, turning it inward. His stories of madness, obsession, and decay, like The Fall of the House of Usher, remain unmatched in their psychological intensity. P. Lovecraft later pushed the genre beyond haunted castles toward cosmic horror, where the true terror lay in the insignificance of humanity before vast, unknowable forces. And finally, Bram Stoker's Dracula sealed the Gothic vampire into legend, weaving folklore, sexuality, and dread into one of the most enduring works of Gothic fiction. Together, these authors created not only a literary tradition but also the foundations of the Gothic imagination that continues to inspire art, music, and culture to this day. Well, now we can start talking about the music, right? But you can see that the Goth subculture is much broader and more expressive than many people imagine. It's not just music, but a lifestyle that goes far beyond other genres of music. By the 1960s and 70s, a few pioneering musicians were already exploring dark, moody sounds. The Velvet Underground, The Doors, and even early David Bowie gave us a taste of eerie lyrics and minor key riffs. In fact, a 1967 rock review actually described Jim Morrison's Doors as Gothic rock, decades before our scene emerged. That shouldn't surprise us. The Doors' songs, like The End or Riders on the Storm, and Bowie's glam theater vibes were full of romantic darkness and theatrical flair. Even punk's precursors like Iggy Pop and Lou Reed had a bit of the velvet darkness in them. All of these broke with the sunny 60s aesthetic and helped pave the way. They showed that rock could be gloomy, mysterious, and weird. Horror films also played their part. As goth fans know, cinema like Nosferatu 1922 or Dracula 1931, with German expressionist shadows and universal monster makeup, became visual and musical inspiration. Our scene grew up loving the same imagery. One writer even points out Goth's debt to German expressionism and classic horror. Fast forward to late 1970s UK and suddenly everything clicks. The punk explosion had subsided and bands were experimenting with new sounds. In 1978 to 79, a group of post-punk bands consciously veered into the darker territory that would define Goth. The very first Goth anthem is often cited as Bela Lugosi's Dead 1979 by Bauhaus, a 7-minute bass drone with Peter Murphy crooning about Dracula. It sounded like nothing before, ghostly, echoing, and intoxicating. Behind that, bands like Siouxsie and the Banshees were also pioneering that sound. Siouxsie Sioux's high, haunting vocals and the Banshees' tribal drums and ringing guitars added a dramatic, witchy edge. Meanwhile, in Manchester, Joy Division, though they never called themselves goth, created song after song steeped in bleak introspection. Tracks like Shadowplay and Transmission had icy guitars and Ian Curtis's desperate baritone. Their moodiness directly influenced Goth's emotional palette. In fact, critics note that even though Joy Division weren't labeled Gothic rock, their chilling atmosphere seeped into our style. As the 1980s dawned, other UK bands joined the list of goth pioneers. The Cure, led by Robert Smith, released 17 Seconds, 1980, and Faith, 1981, albums drenched in spacey reverb and minor chords. Sisters of Mercy formed in 1980, introducing hard-driving beat and bass and Andrew Eldritch's powerful vocals on songs like Alice. Altogether, these bands, Bauhaus, Banshees, Joy, Cure, Sisters, shaped the sonic template of goth. With dark guitars, baritone vocals and lyrics about vampires' loss or the surreal, these bands became the early goth rock scene. By the early 1980s, goth wasn't just a sound, it was a scene with its own clubs and devotees. One legendary spot was London's Batcave, opened July 1982. The Batcave welcomed everything dark and decadent. It was opened by DJ Ollie Wisdom of the band Specimen, and from day one welcomed everything that emerged out of the dark, decadent byproduct of new romantics and punk. It was there that the word Gothic rock finally turned into an actual movement. Music writers had used the term earlier, even tagging Joy Division as Gothic. But at the Batcave, it was here that goth became a movement. Imagine a neon-lit basement in Soho, leather-clad kids dancing to a mix of Bauhaus, Siouxsie Sisters, plus obscure tracks. That was Batcave. Many people still talk about the Batcave as a home. Alien Sex Fiend's singer Mrs. Fiend described it perfectly. All those bands with our music, the look, black clothes, didn't really change us. It was more that we found a home that fitted us. In other words, these artists and clubs didn't create goth so much as give goths a place to be goth. By the mid-80s, similar clubs popped up in other cities, Nightbreed in New York, La Batcave Party in Paris, etc., each spreading the style. The community felt magical. Canadian writer Lisa Ladouceur recalls hearing about the Batcave like finding a message in a bottle. While the UK was birthing Gothic rock, America had its own twist, LA Deathrock. By 1979 to 1980, LA punk bands started adding vampires and horror to their punk. The flagship was Christian Death, formed by singer Ross Williams, right? Their 1982 album Only Theatre of Pain practically invented the term death rock, spinning punk riffs into eerie, theatrical anthems like Romeo's Distress, for example. One person writes that in the early 1980s, a dark and theatrical new sound emerged, giving birth to what would later be known as death rock, and that Christian Death not only defined the genre but also reshaped the trajectory of goth and alternative music. That's a perfect summary. They were at the forefront of American goth, mixing existential lyrics with religious blasphemy and punk energy. Other LA bands joined in. 45 Grave Think, Party Time from Blade and Community FK added their voices. By mid-80s, American death rock and UK goth were rubbing shoulders. Some UK bands even toured the US, while Californian fanzines championed the sound. In fact, music historians note that death rock was pioneered by bands from the early 1980s Los Angeles punk scene, including Christian Death, 45 Grave. So while our style was called goth in England, it spread to the States as death rock, but it was all part of the same family. Dark guitars, dramatic vocals, and a flair for the macabre. By the late 1980s and 90s, goth had spread worldwide. Europe especially became a hub. Germany's scene blossomed into Neue Deutsche Todeskunst, New German Death Art, a poetic Gothic movement with Darkwave bands like Lacrimose and Sopor Aeternus. Big festivals sprang up. Germany's Wave Gothic Treffen began in 1992, and the UK's Whitby Goth Weekend since 1994 drew tens of thousands of fans. Even Eastern Europe got in on it. Poland's Castle Party Festival started in 1994 and is now one of the world's largest goth darkwave gatherings. In short, the goth subculture continued to diversify and spread throughout the world, with major hubs in the UK, Germany, Eastern Europe and beyond. Today you'll find goths everywhere, at clubs in Tokyo and Sao Paulo, at industrial music festivals in North America and in small scenes across Asia and Latin America. The fashion and music have blended with local styles. For example, Japan has its own visual kei scene with goth influences. Even the music evolved into substyles like darkwave, cold wave and ethereal wave, but the core ethos stayed true, moody melodic rock with style and attitude. In essence, our little subculture took the world by storm, or maybe by deliciously dark thunder. So where are we now after 40 years of bats, black eyeliner and beautiful music? I'm happy to say goth is far from dead. From 2010 to 2025, we saw great new bands like Lebanon Hanover and Twin Tribes. Not to mention that every day you find new bands on Bandcamp. The reality is that modern darkwave, or a new wave of gothic rock, is emerging. And perhaps today, with the internet, it's clear that the goth subculture is gaining ground again. People are tired of today's pop crap, and listening to music that sounds like the 80s is much better, regardless of whether the band is a classic like Sisters of Mercy or a new band like Hinford. The music that emerged in the 80s has only gained more notoriety and is being explored more from 2010 to the present day. So that's it, folks. I hope you enjoyed our first video in this format. We will be posting more content, interesting facts and interviews soon. Please don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. Top code. Thank you very much and enjoy the silence.